All right, so are you ready to dive into a story that's just unbelievable?
I'm ready when you are. Let's do it.
Okay, because we're talking about a 10-year-old kid, a tiny raft, we're talking barely bigger than a bathtub,
Oh, wow.
and a whole night lost on Lake Ontario.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, and not even like, July or August.
Wow.
We're talking April.
Oh, that water is
Freezing cold.
ice cold.
This is the story of David Blackmore,
Okay.
and it's going to have you on the edge of your seat. We're going to be pulling from a couple different sources. We've got David's own memories from his book, Captain and the Kid. We've also got some really interesting news reports from the time from the Toronto Daily Star.
Oh, wow.
And we even have something David wrote 30 years later, looking back on this whole experience.
Oh, wow.
It's truly, truly remarkable. So let's get into it. Okay.
All right, picture this. 1968, Regent Park. Now,
Yeah.
back then it had a bit of a reputation. And for a 10-year-old like David, it seems like, the
Yeah.
rules were a little looser. Go out, play, have fun, be back by dinner.
Right.
And we know from Captain and the Kid that David, he was definitely one of those kids, like always looking for an adventure,
Yeah.
even if it meant maybe pushing the limits a little bit,
Of course.
a
Yeah.
little bit of mischief. But
And you have to remember, too,
yeah,
Regent Park back then, it was a different world. Families were dealing with a lot of struggles.
right.
And for kids, well, let's just say they had a lot of freedom to roam.
Yeah,
Maybe not always the best kind of freedom.
right.
So it's important to remember that context, I think. Totally.
Hmm.
So one day, David and his friend Michael, they decide to head down to Cherry Beach,
Okay.
which if you know Toronto,
Yeah.
it's right there on the lake.
Right on the lake.
And they've got this little inflatable raft.
Okay.
And of course, they're just itching to get out on the water. But David, being David, he decides, you know what, I'm going to go solo today.
Oh, boy.
It's a beautiful spring day.
Right.
What could possibly go wrong?
Famous last words, maybe.
So, of course, this is where things take a bit of a turn. Right?
Okay.
So David's out there. He's paddling around. Probably feels like he's on top of the world, king of the lake.
Right.
And he decides to just lay back for a little bit, soak up the sun.
Yeah.
Harmless enough, right?
Uh-huh.
Except while he's relaxing, the wind picks up and it starts pushing the raft. And of course, David,
Yeah.
he doesn't even realize it.
Oh, God.
And by the time he sits up and looks around,
Yeah.
he is way further out than he ever intended to be.
Oh, my God.
And you have to imagine what's going through his head in that moment.
I can't even imagine. As an adult, I would be terrified.
This little speck
Right.
out on this massive lake. The sun is starting to set. He's completely alone. He tries to paddle back.
Yeah.
But, I mean, let's be real.
Yeah.
He's one kid against, the full force of Lake Ontario.
Yeah.
So as night falls,
Oh, wow.
he huddles in the raft, uses his sweater to try and stay warm.
Oh, my God.
And that isolation, that feeling of being totally alone, it must have been absolutely terrifying.
Absolutely. And especially as a child.
Right.
I mean, we can't downplay that kind of sudden awareness of being in real danger.
Right.
It's a lot for anybody to handle, let alone a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to his resilience,
Right.
his strength,
Yeah.
that he's able to, hold on to hope even while he's so afraid.
Meanwhile, back on shore, it is a completely different story.
Oh, bet.
The Toronto Daily Star articles from this time really paint a picture of just pure chaos, frantic searching. We're talking 75 police officers, over 100 volunteers.
Oh, my gosh.
Planes, helicopters, they were pulling out all the stops to try and find this kid.
I mean, you can imagine the sense of urgency.
Oh, yeah.
Every minute counts,
Yes.
especially with the water temperature
Right.
being so low in April.
Absolutely. And they knew that, time was really of the essence. And there's even this detail that I found in the news reports, and it's almost hard to believe, but at one point, they mistook a picnic table for a capsized boat.
Oh, wow.
That's how on edge everyone was.
Okay.
Everyone was just looking for any sign of David. But in the middle of all of this, we have a new character who enters the story,
Okay.
Captain Archie Hodge of the Port Dauphine.
Okay.
And he is fascinating.
I like where this is going.
Because Hodge, he wasn't just some captain,
Yeah.
He was really into the science of the lake,
Oh, wow.
especially the currents. Like, he was obsessed
Interesting.
with how the currents worked. And we even have this letter that he wrote talking about the night that David went missing. And he's listening to the news on the radio, and he hears about this kid, and immediately he starts doing calculations.
Wow.
He's using his knowledge of the currents to try and predict where this raft might have drifted. Talk about a cool head in a crisis, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so remarkable about this whole thing.
Right.
Most people in that situation, they would just feel totally powerless.
Right.
But Hodge, he had this incredible knowledge base to draw on.
Yeah.
He knew that even, unpredictable things, things like wind and water,
Yeah.
they still follow certain rules.
Right.
It's like he was able to see the solution to this giant puzzle
Right.
when everyone else just saw chaos.
Exactly. And that's where his expertise is really key, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're talking about Lake Ontario here.
Yeah.
It's a huge lake
Right.
with its own complex currents, wind patterns.
Right.
Even just the water temperature itself plays a role.
Yeah.
Hodge would have been looking at all of that.
Right.
The type of raft David was on, the time he went missing,
Right.
potentially even things like the lunar phase.
Wow, really?
Yeah, because that can affect tides.
Huh.
It really shows how deeply he understood the lake,
Yeah.
that he was even able to try and make this kind of prediction.
So they're out there. It's the dead of night. And Hodge is relying on these calculations to guide them.
Wow.
And then, as dawn breaks, they spot something way off in the distance. Just this tiny speck on the water.
Oh my gosh.
And Hodge, in his letter, he describes seeing this faint wave. It's David waving his arm.
Wow.
And he said this wave of relief just washed over him. So they pulled David on board, they wrap him in blankets,
Oh, I bet.
gave him hot chocolate. I mean, can you imagine that moment?
I can't even imagine. To go from just complete fear and isolation
Right.
to suddenly being surrounded by all these people who've been searching all night.
Yeah, incredible.
It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
Except it really happened. And you have to think about what that rescue meant, not just for David, but for Hodge, too.
Of course, yeah.
To have put so much faith in his own knowledge
Yeah.
and then to actually find David alive. It's amazing.
And the Toronto Star mentions that David, he actually spent a couple hours in the hospital
Yeah.
just as a precaution, make sure everything's okay.
Of course, yeah. And you might think, okay, you survive a night adrift on Lake Ontario, you're probably good, right? Like you've had your lifetime's worth of adventure.
Right, exactly.
But that's actually where David's story, it takes this really inspiring turn, I think, because this experience, it doesn't break him. It shapes him,
Yeah.
30 years later, David actually writes about this for the Toronto Star.
Oh, wow.
The article is called Saving Grace.
Okay.
And he talks about how that night on the lake, it wasn't just Hodge who saved him. It was also this realization that life is precious.
Yeah.
That second chances are a gift,
Right.
And get this, instead of staying away from the water,
Right.
from the memory of that night,
Yeah.
he actually becomes an avid boater.
Wow. That's incredible. Isn't that something? I mean, he could have just avoided water
Right.
the rest of his life, but no, he embraces it.
Yeah, he takes that experience and it fuels him to, to really live life,
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
just shows the power of the human spirit
Right.
to find meaning, even in the toughest times.
Yeah, absolutely. And he doesn't stop there. David, he ends up dedicating a huge part of his life to giving back to his community. He actually goes on to found a community arts center for kids.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
And he says, he credits Hodge for this, not just for pulling him out of the lake,
Right.
but for showing him what it means to, to care for others.
It's amazing how one event,
Yeah.
as scary as it was, can have these ripple effects.
Yeah,
Makes you think,
it does. And
Well-
speaking of being connected, there's this one detail from David's account in Saving Grace that really stuck with me.
Okay.
He talks about during that long night out there on the lake, he kept seeing lights in the distance, hearing boat motors.
Oh, wow.
And he would scream, wave his arms, but it was no use.
Oh, it just gives me chills to be so close
Right.
and yet completely lost at the same time.
It makes you wonder, like, how many other people were out there that night looking for him?
Yeah.
You're so close, but just,
Missed him.
missed him. And it just makes you realize how much had to line up perfectly
Right.
for David to be rescued.
It's incredible.
It is a story about luck, for sure, but it's also about, quick thinking, resilience, and the incredible expertise of a captain who knew that lake like the back of his hand. And I think that's what I love about these deep dives that we do. Yeah.
Because we get to explore these amazing stories of, what humans are capable of.
Right, exactly.
The courage,
Yeah.
the resilience. And I think it leaves us all with this sense of hope
Yeah,
that even in the darkest nights, there's always a chance for things to turn out okay.
I agree. I think that's a great note to end on.
I do too.
Yeah.
Thanks for diving into this amazing story with me.
Of course. Always a pleasure.